Ian Britton, an academic who studies volunteers in policing internationally, and I'm delighted to continue our series of interviews on Policing TV with experts and leaders from around the world of volunteers in policing, by being joined today by Dr. Melissa Pepper. Melissa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Great to be here today. I'm Dr. Melissa Pepper. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Greenwich. This is a second career for me, though. So prior to this, I was a government social researcher, first in the Home Office and then in the London Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime.
Thank you. And Melissa, delighted you have been able to join us today. So Melissa, can you give us a brief history of how you came to be involved academically in volunteers in policing?
Well, it started with that other career that I used to have, as I mentioned, Ian. So I was a government social researcher for a long time in what is now known as the London Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, or MOPAC, and prior to this was known as the Metropolitan Police Authority. So this is the body that's involved in the budget and the strategic direction of London's Metropolitan Police Service. And many moons ago, I was doing a master's degree and we had a presentation from some police cadets, so the youngest volunteers in policing. And I was just really struck by what they contributed to policing and what they got out of it as well. So this started a real interest for me in volunteers in policing. And from the police cadets, this grew to broader volunteers in policing. And MOPAC itself also involved volunteers in its work through stop and search community monitoring networks and different sort of advisory boards. So it was really my professional background that brought this interest in volunteers, what they did, what they contributed, and some of the challenges that they faced in their roles.
Thank you. And we'll come back to the volunteer cadets, because that sounds a really interesting aspect. A lot of your research work has focused on police support volunteers, on PSVs in the UK. For those viewers, especially those outside of UK policing, can you explain what a police support volunteer is?
Sure. So a police support volunteer, or a PSV, as you said, are citizens who give their time to support their local police service and their local community. So they're usually non-uniformed, so they're different to special constables or volunteer police officers. They're usually non-uniformed. Sometimes they might have a polo shirt or some other identifying feature, but often they're non-uniformed. They're non-warranted, so they don't have powers of arrest, but they can make a really important contribution to their police services. They carry out roles such as front counter, administration type roles, working on the front desk in police stations, quality callbacks to ask members of the public about the service they've received from the police service. And the list is endless, really. It goes on and on. So depending on the environment of the force, depending on the area of where the police service is, they could carry out roles such as puppy walking, mounted horseback volunteers, looking after fleets of vehicles, working in resources and stores. There's a few roles that police volunteers cannot carry out, which has been ingrained within legislation. But apart from that, there is a real vast array of roles that police support volunteers can get involved in.
Thank you. And your research work with police support volunteers has had that real strength that you've engaged a lot directly with the volunteers, talking with them, spending time to really understand and appreciate their perspectives and that sort of lived experience of being a volunteer in policing. Are the key lessons from your research for police services and how they best manage and support for volunteers?
Yeah, so I think some of the findings that really stand out for me in my research with PSVs is that where it works well, it works really well. And where it works well is where there is an infrastructure in place to support and develop that volunteer. So that includes things such as training, development, good induction, and perhaps most crucially, good volunteer management. As one of my participants in one of my early studies said to me, it has to be somebody's job to worry about volunteers. This can't just be left to chance. It has to be a paid role in which somebody is responsible for managing and developing those volunteers, for understanding their motivations, for knowing their local police colleagues so they can identify roles that would be suitable for them to get involved in. Personalised volunteer management is what makes volunteering work well in policing and across a range of other sectors, of course. And one of the things that I really comes up again and again within my research is that volunteering tends to work very well on an individual level. So where a paid member of staff or where a police officer really gets volunteering and really sees the benefits of involving volunteers in their service, that's where it works well. Some of the challenges arise at an institutional level, so where forward-thinking and officers and staff who really buy into the volunteering model, where they move on, sometimes it's difficult to replicate that sense of investment. So it's about really bringing that individual commitment to an institutional infrastructure. And I should say early on that volunteering only works well where we've got a properly resourced police service. So this has never been and should never be about replacing paid roles. We need a government that properly funds its police service, properly resources its police service, so volunteers can bring additionality. They should never be a substitute for paid roles. And almost every volunteer I've ever spoken to in my research has wholeheartedly agreed with that. They don't want to take jobs away. They want to bring additionality that volunteers and members of the community can only really bring themselves.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier that one of the things which had drawn you into this field in the first place was the wonderful volunteer police cadets for young people as volunteers in policing. Again, for an audience which may not know what the volunteer police cadet programme involves, can you explain a little bit what a volunteer cadet is?
Yeah, so the volunteer police cadet programme just seems to have grown and grown. So way back when I was doing research on it, there was only one type of police cadet, and it was from the age of around 13, 14 up to 18. Volunteer police cadet opportunities have really expanded now. So we've got the junior cadets and the mini police, which really allows younger and younger children to be involved in police cadet type tasks. So depending on age and depending on where the cadets are located, they undertake a variety of tasks, some of which are really community focused. So they do things such as working at local community events. Some cadets are contributed to really high profile events, coronation type events, events marking D-Day and other really high profile celebrations. In London, they're frequently handing out water to all the runners on London Marathon Day. So they do some really high profile events. They're also involved in kind of education and training type roles, and also some cadets move into more operational spaces. You know, they bring something that our adult police officers and staff cannot bring, in that they're young, they look young, and they're often involved in exercises such as test purchasing, so buying age-restricted products such as alcohol or knives, to really understand if retailers are selling to underage customers. So there's lots of different strands to what they bring to policing, from community type events right up to kind of operational contributions as well.
Is there evidence that the volunteer police cadets makes a difference?
I think there is, and I think there's two strands to that. So we can really quantify police cadet involvement. They're often a uniformed presence, so it's possible to kind of count up the number of hours that they bring to policing through events such as community events, London Marathon, high-profile events, as I mentioned earlier, test purchasing operations. So in terms of impact, similar to how we can understand part of police officers' impact, of course not all of it, but you can quantify the hours that they bring, the visibility that they bring to communities. So that's one strand of the police cadet impact. I think the other strand is sometimes more difficult to measure, but no less important, certainly no less important. And that is the impact that being part of the cadet programme has on cadets themselves. Some of the work that I did very early in my research career was around the social capital indicators, you know, feelings of belonging, access to resources and opportunities that perhaps some young people wouldn't have had access to, working alongside peers that perhaps they wouldn't have been exposed to in other areas of their lives. And our cadets come from lots of different backgrounds. Cadets are not always in fact, certainly are not always young people for whom life has always been easy. So some of our cadets come from backgrounds where they've had difficult relationships with authority figures. Perhaps school wasn't or isn't a great place for them to be. Maybe there isn't a great family relationship. Some of our cadets may have come into contact with the police through, stop and search situations or even being arrested. So our cadets come from lots of different backgrounds with lots of different experiences. But I think what unites them is the experience that they have within the police cadet programme. And I think that's what I found so fascinating about that piece of work that I did, was to see young people from so many different backgrounds finding a commonality and a common ground within the volunteer police cadet programme.
You've recently undertaken research with another somewhat unsung group of volunteers here in the UK, so Community Speedwatch. Once again, just to help our viewers, can you explain what Community Speedwatch volunteers do in the communities?
Yeah, that's been a great project to be involved in, and it's kind of taken me into an area of policing which I was less familiar with, which is roads policing. So this was a study that I've carried out with Professor Karen Bullock from the University of Surrey. It was very generously funded by the Road Safety Trust, who are an awesome organisation that fund research and pilot all things sort of road safety related. So Community Speedwatch volunteers are members of the community that work alongside the police using approved speed detection devices to monitor traffic speeds in their local communities. They don't have any enforcement powers, so this is very much an education exercise. Volunteers use the speed detection devices to monitor the speeds and take the registration details of drivers who are going too fast in certain areas of their communities. Drivers are sent a letter which kind of acknowledges that they were driving too fast and offers education advice. After a few letters, they may then receive a visit from a police officer. Again, it's not an enforcement activity, but it is really around engaging drivers in education type behaviour. And I found this project fascinating because I always feel like speeding is very much the crime of the everyday classes. Ian, I'm sure you've gone over the speed limit before. I certainly have as well. I'm not embarrassed to say, I should be embarrassed to say that I've been on a speed awareness course. It's a crime that any of us with a driving licence has the capacity to carry out at any time we step behind the wheel of a car. So it's a really important group of volunteers that are providing additionality to their police colleagues in terms of making communities safer on the roads.
And in terms of your research with the Community Speedwatch volunteers, are there key findings in terms of how the programme develops in the future?
Yeah, so the findings, I think one that really stands out for me is the motivations for these volunteers to be involved. And I'm always really interested in why people want to get involved, why people want to volunteer at all, but why they want to volunteer for community safety type activities. And I call these micro motivations with Community Speedwatch volunteers. They speak at a very granular level about why they are volunteering. So they often talk about their children, their grandchildren. They talk about the safety of their dogs when they're out walking their dogs. I've spoken to horse riders who talk about wanting traffic to go slower on the road so it doesn't scare their horses. They've talked about specific roads in their community. So it's real kind of grassroots volunteering. These people have noticed a problem, they've experienced the problem themselves, their neighbours have experienced it, and they want to do something to help make a change there. So that's been really important, understanding the motivations. In terms of the contribution, they bring a local knowledge. They bring a locality that often their police colleagues can't bring because they don't live in the area. So they bring a real local knowledge of roads and hotspots within their villages and towns which are problematic for speeding. And I think they also bring they bring the hours. They bring time. And I said earlier, volunteers should never ever be a substitute for a paid role. But ultimately, the areas that Community Speedwatch volunteers are monitoring are areas that would never have been covered by a police officer or a policing team. So it really is that additionality. Volunteers, from these kind of micro motivations, they speak about very big contributions. And some of them equate their role to literally saving a life. Some of them talked about, I don't have much of an opportunity in any other area of my life to be a lifesaver, but in this I do. So they really equate their contribution to possibly saving somebody's life. They'll never know, thankfully. You can't measure what didn't happen, but they do equate their contribution to stopping things from happening. But there were frustrations there. There were often frustrations which link back to infrastructure, about dedicated volunteer management, and about feeling that the police value their role and see them as part of the solution to road safety problems. They want to feel like more of the team. And as I said before about my findings with police support volunteers, where it works well, it works incredibly well. Where they get the occasional visit from a police officer or even a bit of a thumbs up as a police car drives past, it works really well. Those small acts in terms of the impact they make on morale are huge. But of course that works in the opposite as well, where they feel that they're ignored or they're not integrated. That can really be detrimental to morale as well.
You're one of the leading researchers internationally in this field of volunteers and policing. Why do you think that developing the academic research in respect to volunteers and policing is so important?
Well, thank you for saying that for a start. And it's taken me a while to get used to be a leading expert in anything, so I'm very grateful that you said that. I think it's important because if we are in a space where we're using volunteers, and we need to understand them. Volunteers are making a sizable contribution to policing, both in the UK and much further afield. And if we are going to involve people, if people are going to give their time to policing, we really need to understand why they're doing it. We need to understand why we need them and how we're going to involve them. And that can only come through some decent research. But what I really like about being a leading expert, your words in, not mine, in volunteers in policing, is that it is a part of academia which is wholeheartedly embedded within the practitioner community. This is not something that is done separately from volunteers and separately from police practitioners and police policymakers. It really does happen side by side. So all of our field work is led by the volunteer contribution. Volunteers, police officers and staff are our co-researchers, they're our co-creators of knowledge. It can only happen if we are embedded within that practitioner community. And it's a nice space to be because that's where you start to see the results. But that's what I like about being in this field. And I think that speaks to kind of previous career that I had within government social research, where all of my research was embedded within stakeholders, practitioners, policymakers. And I've brought that to my academic career. And luckily I've found, a whole group of like-minded academics in the police volunteers field who are already embedded alongside practitioners and policymakers. That's the only way that our research is going to have an impact. And for me, that's the only point in doing it.
You recently attended the International Symposium on Volunteer Policing up in Edinburgh, Scotland. Do you think there's a lot we can learn from one another just in terms of those different models the different countries and agencies have around this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just going back to my last answer, that event was a prime example of how this field of academia is utterly immersed within a practitioner policymaker world. We were in the minority there as academics, and that's good, that's important, because we were a small team of academics that were amongst all of the practitioners and policymakers who are doing this on the ground. And that is really important to me, that, as I said, we're doing this alongside rather than to volunteers and police officers and staff. So we certainly can learn from other countries around the world, and I think the Edinburgh event both it kind of demonstrated innovation and creativity in involving volunteers in other parts of the world, but it also showed how far we are in the UK as well, I think. So I think it was really interesting to see both sides of that. I take a lot of inspiration from particularly the work of City of London Police, who are really being creative and forward-looking in how they're involving volunteers within their cybercrime agenda. That's incredible, and that is just going to grow and grow. And I'm also really fascinated as well at how culturally and historically a country builds a platform for volunteers to be involved in. And I think the way we involve volunteers and the way we tap into our communities very much rests on, the country itself, the ethos of citizenship, the building blocks of the police service within that country. This is all part of the same story. For example, I'm always really excited when we've got our Japanese colleagues involved in our international events, and they've got some incredible ways that they involve citizens in very kind of unobtrusive community safety, which is ingrained as part of everyday activities. Walking children to school, planting flowers in the local community, all of which carries this element of capable guardianship, which we've seen really reduce in a lot of societies with the lack of things like bus conductors, park keepers, and kind of more traditional roles. And Japan have got the fabulously named Bow Wow Patrol as well, which is a team of dog walkers which go out with their dogs as part of their usual exercise, but again, allow this additional level of capable guardianship within communities. Anything called Bow Wow Patrol has got my vote, Ian, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa Pepper, for some really interesting insights across, what is just the huge breadth for volunteering in policing and worldwide. It's really fascinating insights, and I think especially important that sense of the academic bedrock of this, as you say, understanding volunteers, understanding the experience, having a research community which is fully integrated with the practice and leadership communities around volunteering programs. Volunteers are such a major part of policing in so many countries around the world, but rarely get that attention at a senior and strategic level that they deserve. So very interesting to hear your insights, and we look forward to having another conversation as the research programme develops further in the future. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ian. It's been great to talk to you today.
Thank you.